pregnancy support group, has it? Very, very good. Hey, well, listen, good morning, everybody. I just want to remember today the families of the 51 victims in Christchurch. I think we all remember where we were 3 years ago, pretty indelibly imprinted on all of our brains. I think what struck us very clearly was just the huge grace, compassion, and just of the Muslim community at that time. I myself was down there within a matter of hours. I spent 3 or 4 days then subsequently down there. I lost one of my employees at Air New Zealand there, so it was a pretty full-on time for everyone there, and just how the community came together was pretty special to see that all work. So with that, happy to take any questions you may have.
What struck you when you were down there? Can you just walk us through
Yeah, well, I was actually driving between meetings at work on a Friday afternoon, and I got the news, and then I directed very quickly to the airport, grabbed a bag, and I was down there, I think, just after 5 o'clock or 6 o'clock, somewhere around there. I was then down there for the next 3 or 4 days. Initial shock, it was a very surreal experience. I'd been travelling through Mexico City when I'd heard about the Christchurch earthquakes, and I had called my folks back at home there, and to think this was happening in Christchurch again was pretty surreal, to be honest, as a feeling. And then when I arrived there, it was just the way everybody was working together incredibly well. I mean, it was pretty impressive to see from an Air New Zealand perspective. We had a responsibility to keep to bring police in and out of the city, to bring families in and out of the city, and at the same time, as I said, we were dealing with the death of one of our employees as well. And so I met with the families and the Lillick's family, and just the huge grace, compassion of the Muslim community, and the way they modelled out that to all of us as New Zealanders was pretty special to see. The way that the rest of the Christchurch community got around the families as well, and continue to do so. It's been pretty special to watch as well. So no, it was a really unique time for all of us, and just just something that we just never thought would ever happen, and happened, as we well know. Sorry? Look, I think the announcements that have made yesterday, they'll give us some relief, but they really, we've got a much wider, broader cost of living crisis going on in the country. When you see, yes, there's pressure at the pump, no doubt about it. When you think about the pressure that's happening with respect to food prices up 13%, when you now see that weekly rents are up over $150, there's a lot more to be done, and that's why we've been advocating very strongly just for a very simple, inflation-adjust tax thresholds package, as we've been talking about in the last couple of weeks, because for the average earner, that's going to give them $870 a year, which is not much. It doesn't make them rich, but it actually gives them some ability to be able to deal with this. So, look, it gives some relief, but fundamentally, there's a lot more to do because it's much broader than just petrol. Well, look, it's going to give some relief, right, for a period of time. Both those measures will, in terms of the excise tax cap and halving public transport. But there's a broader set of cost of living dynamics at play, and that's really what the government's got to get its head around. What I would say to you is, to be honest, I think the government's highly reactive. I think it's reacting to the media. I think it's reacting to the public, and I think it's reacting to the opposition. And so, a week ago we didn't have a cost of living crisis. Now we have one, and there's a concession being made. And I think that's been the reality of this government over the last year, that it just reacts to the pressure that comes from the opposition and from media and from the public. Sorry, Jenna.
How much do you think this boils down to political or safeguarding themselves from the political damage they're inflicting on themselves rather than actually wanting to help them?
Yeah, my personal view, as I've talked to you about before, in terms of the COVID responses and actions, if you think about autonomous sanctions, pressure we've been putting in place about humanitarian visas from the Ukraine, if you think about the cost of living crisis. A week ago, the Prime Minister was denying it was actually happening, and all of a sudden it is happening. So I think it is political. I think it is responsive in terms of just a government that's reacting, doesn't really have a master plan of where we're going, and has got very tactical at just responding to pressure points from the media, from the public, and from the opposition. Sorry, Jason.
So do you think that they saw the poll, saw that they were down 3 points, and just said, okay, well, we need to respond to that, so we're leading vote?
Look, I think what you're going to see is yes, all of a sudden international tourists will be coming back. We saw a concession yesterday on excise tax and on fuel at the pump because of cost of living. It wasn't there a week ago, but it was there yesterday. You'll see some concession around international tourists coming back. You watch mandates will be next, and then I think there'll be some concession on Three Waters. All of that is just a responsive, reactive, reflexive response to the politics and to the public, the media and the opposition.
So you think the government is putting
No, what I'm saying to you is it's a reactive government. It doesn't have a plan. It's making it up as it goes along, and it's just responding to the stimulus that it gets in front of it, and that changes each given week. Sorry, Amelia.
Isn't it responding to the criticisms and learning from the reaction?
That's what we're trying to do as an opposition. We're opposing the government and we're proposing ideas. And what I'm saying to you is our proposals are actually making them respond, which is a good thing. That's great. We've got some relief out of petrol as of yesterday. It won't go all the way. It doesn't solve all the broader, wider cost of living problems. But I think we're doing our job pretty well as an opposition. Is my takeaway. Luke.
Yesterday, the government all of a sudden came out with an energy crisis.
Yeah.
Not said to be one last week. Petrol's expensive, but is there an energy crisis?
Well, look, I mean, the question for me is the government has to take some responsibility for this cost of living crisis. It can continue to blame external things, and let's be clear, there are external factors that are driving the cost of living crisis and having an impact on the cost of things. But there are equally things, as we've been talking about now for months, as the OECD has been talking about for months, which is, hey, listen, you're about to go spend $6 billion of additional new spending on top of a record amount of spending that's happened over the last 4 years. OECD saying, hey, listen, New Zealand, watch that. You might want to spend, want to be a bit more thoughtful about how you spend that money. Well, at this point, the point is there's no need to cut services. It's just about spend the money smarter. Is kind of what that's about. There's $6 billion of incremental new money that is about to be spent in the May budget. What we've been saying for some time is, hey, why don't you be quite intentional, a bit more thoughtful about that? That's where we were saying, hey, listen, why don't we take a third of it, do the taxation, inflation-adjusted taxation thresholds, give relief to all Kiwis, or as many as we can, and go forward that way. Sorry.
So just to be clear, what do you make of the timing of that announcement last night? What is it reacting to?
It's reacting to the pressure from the media, from the public and from the opposition to say that there is a cost of living crisis in New Zealand. We've been talking about it for months. The OECD is saying, hey, listen, New Zealand, you've got to sort of start to think about what you are doing that could be feeding that inflation, meaning, make sure your spending is being adjusted, as we've been talking about in these press conferences now for a couple of months. And really what it was a reflexive, reactive response. And that's what we're seeing, from the government at the moment. And I think that's what Kiwis are sensing, in recent polls that you've undertaken yourself. You're starting to see that people are saying, where is the plan? Where are we going? We all feel a bit lost. How are we marching ourselves out of this place?
It's frustrating for you, in your position as leader of the opposition. The government can see a problem and react to it and do something about it. You can only throw out, issues or ideas and things like that. Is that frustrating for you being in this?
Well, really, I'd like to be in government. Yeah, there's no doubt about that. But the question for me very clearly is my role, as I said from the very beginning on day one, is not just to oppose the government, but it is to propose ideas. If in that provocation, it's actually giving stimulation and it's actually leading to a government that's actually responding and coming up with some, taking on board some of those ideas, doing something, that's a good outcome for New Zealand. And that's us playing our role in our democracy, I think, very well. Jason.
About the issue of inflation and government spending.
Yep.
Next budget, the finance minister said there is going to be $6 billion of new spending. Are you saying that to curb the inflation problem, the finance minister should say, take that record $6 billion and make it just down to the normal 2 or 3?
Yeah, what we're saying to him is, look, you've had record spending over the last 4 years, right? Everyone understands that. We've already got that as the baseline. This year, we're going to get loaded up with another $6 billion of incremental new money. And what we're saying in that, our view was, look, a third of that money could be put to inflation-adjusted tax thresholds. It's a practical, sensible move. It happens in lots of countries. The tax thresholds haven't moved for years. There's been inflation over the period of this government, I think about 11.5%. So it's a sensible, pragmatic way of doing it. And we would actually trust Kiwis to spend and save that money more so than how Grant Robertson would spend it. Even if you took that money out, you're then left with $4.3 billion, which is still a record amount of budget money that we've had ever in the history of this country. So you've still got plenty of cash to be able to spend on other things. Again, in that context, all we're saying with the OECD and our own comments over the last few months is be judicious, be thoughtful about where you're spending that, be smart about how you're spending that money.
That money will impact inflation because it's $4 billion. Are you calling it to basically just say, as you said, we have an inflation problem,
We're just asking Grant Robertson, who's addicted to spending, to say, hey, listen, are you spending that money to the very best of your ability? Are you prioritising it the right way? Have you got good fiscal discipline around it? Have you got a good return on investment when you spend that money? Is that the best way that you could spend it to have the biggest difference, to make the biggest impact? So, in what context? No. Look, I think GST is actually a really simple, good mechanic. When you start fiddling around with GST, as we've seen in other countries, it gets very, very difficult very quickly. No, I think I wouldn't want to touch that. I think there's other things that you could do, particularly as I've been saying over the last few months. I think just being smart on spending, because in a constrained economy that hasn't opened up to the world yet, where you've got labour shortages and you've got a constrained economy going on and you've got a lot of government spending going in, there is a component of that that's leading into an inflation. What I'd like to see is a country that actually is, if you think about inflation, how do we have to deal with it? We fundamentally have to deal with the Reserve Bank making monetary policy and taking rates up, but if you can't just leave it all to them to do all the heavy lifting, so therefore you have to augment it with really smart, sensible spending, and make sure that you're being judicious and smart and pragmatic and prudent with how you spend your money with good discipline. And the third thing is really you've got to open up the economy because of the constraints that we've got, and ultimately unleash enterprise in the business as well. Sorry? Sorry, I didn't hear the question. No, I think there's a way in which you could. I think we need to be highly transparent, and I just say to all the fuel company CEOs, they need to pass it through to customers directly, and I think there's ways you can monitor that and make that pretty obvious whether that is or isn't happening. Well, bottom line is, I think you would find. I think you'd be a pretty brave fuel CEO not to pass that on. I wouldn't want to be in that situation if I was in the issue. Well, we've just got to make sure that the cap is actually passed, the cut is actually passed through really cleanly. I think there's ways in which you could do that, and you'd do that pretty clearly. And if there was any, deviation from that, I think we'd have some different conversations pretty quickly. Yep. Look, the bottom line here is it's a small piece of the equation. I think it's, $25 to $40 million. I get why they've done it, but it's, again, a small amount of relief. We've got a much bigger, broader set of problems here. That's what I'm trying to do is say, listen, lift up our eyes a little bit, see the bigger picture as to what's actually happening here. And, there are many actual drivers into this cost of living crisis. International we've talked about, domestic we've talked about, spending we've talked about, tax we've talked about, it's just how you actually put it all together is really important. Okay, last question. Yes.
Could the government just extend it and encourage more people onto public transport, or how about low-income families with using public transport?
Look, that's something down the road for them to think through, and we'll look at that close to the time. At the moment, all I'm saying to you is a relatively small part of what was announced yesterday, and it's a relatively small amount of relief, and there's a broader set of issues at play. Hey, listen, I've got to go to caucus, so thank you for your time. Appreciate it.